Coronavirus isn't just a threat to your health, it's a threat to the economy. As infection numbers ticked up, the stock market had its worst day in 12 years. So it's probably not surprising that President Trump has promised very dramatic plans to help keep the economy up and running. Basically, we're talking about a new stimulus. But that just raises a different question. Can you really solve a public health problem with economic policy? With me today to talk about the coronavirus economy and what to do about it is Veronique Derougy. She's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a frequent contributor to Reason magazine. Veronique, thanks for coming to talk with me.
Thanks for having me.
So, isn't this the government's job to step in times of economic crisis and to help people out? What is wrong with President Trump saying that he wants dramatic intervention measures?
So the problem isn't so much that the government would do something in terms of emergency. The question is, what can they really do? And that's really actually hits really the big question, because this is not an emergency like we've seen. This is not the Great Recession. This is not a natural disaster that keeps a whole city underwater. It's very different. It's a public health issue with economic consequences. And it's kind of unclear what the best way to go about it. And unfortunately, as Rahm Emanuel said, that, it's like you can't let a crisis go to waste. What you see is a lot of people pushing policies that they've always supported and using the coronavirus as a way to push them through, even though they wouldn't actually have any impact.
Let's talk about some of those policies specifically. One of the big ideas that people have talked about is a payroll tax holiday. This is something we've done before in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and people are talking about doing it again. So basically on your paycheck, you have deductions for Social Security, for Medicare. Those deductions would go away for some period of time. This is a tax break. People would get more money on their paychecks. What's wrong with that?
So the problem with a payroll tax cut is how you're going to design it, but also what it's supposed to achieve. So one of the reasons why there could be an economic problem right now, it's not so much because people don't want to spend money or don't have enough cash, but it's because they actually are trying to limit their commercial activities. They're trying to not go to the theater. They're trying to not go to the restaurant. They're not cash straps. They're just basically forcing some savings on themselves because of the health issue. So if you do a payroll tax cut that is on the employee side, you're just really very likely not going to be increasing the incentive for people to interact more in places where they could catch the virus. On the employer side, it's questionable. It is true that a lot of small businesses that are faced with a decrease in demand for their products may benefit from it, but can the reduction be big enough and fast enough to compensate for all this loss in demand? It's just hard to see. If this continues for a long time, the kind of payroll tax relief you would need is not something that this government can afford.
Right. So it's hard to make a case for fiscal stimulus when goods aren't being produced and people aren't leaving their homes to go buy more stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's really important to understand that the way fiscal stimulus usually works is by changing people's behavior. And it's hard to see when the reason why people aren't consuming things is because they don't want to go to stores. They don't want to be, because they don't want to go to restaurants because they don't want to be infected. They don't want to go to the movies because they don't want to be infected. How giving them more money is going to really create a kind of boost that is needed. And the same on the employer side, when the problem isn't so much that they can't employ people who would be unemployed right now, but it's the fact that customers are not coming to their stores and buying their things. So it's just it's hard to see how that would really help.
Well, what about another idea I've heard a lot about recently, which is basically bailouts, in particular for the service sector and the travel sector? You mentioned hotels and restaurants. People have talked about giving money to the airline industry. The airline industry is going to be hurt pretty bad by this, at least over the next couple of weeks and probably over the next couple of months. And travel is very important to a functioning economy. Is it a bad idea for the government to step in and make the airlines whole here to try and keep them afloat? They are a vital part of the economy.
They're an important part of the economy, but unless everything goes to a halt, which we're not yet talking about this.
We're not there, but Italy is.
Yeah, well, Italy, I think, has many other problems, right? Unless they put a ban on anyone coming in and anyone leaving the country or anyone traveling to other states, where we're not there yet. I mean, the airline industry may actually not be in the short term the priority. I mean, the people who are really hurt and who don't have much padding right now are actually small businesses or employees in restaurants and bars who a big part of their compensation is people tipping them. But if people are not coming and ordering drinks and then tipping them, they're going to be feeling the pain quite significantly and very quickly.
We've tried fiscal stimulus before. Actually, it started with George W. Bush in 2008, passed a $150 billion stimulus, gave most Americans about a $600 check as a result. And then in 2009, when President Obama came into office, there was an $800 billion stimulus that was distributed between social spending, infrastructure spending, and tax cuts. What lessons can we draw from those previous attempts at stimulus that might be relevant now?
So there are two things. With the President Bush stimulus, it goes to the fact that we were able to see it's completely ineffective to actually give people money.
Why?
So the reason is that it actually doesn't change the incentives that people have to work, invest, and save. So when you don't have policy that actually fundamentally change the way people behave, you don't get the kind of structural changes that you need that really boost the economy. The other thing is, like, actually, when you give people, and some of the Obama administration stimulus, we saw this with it too, is when you give people money at the time when they are feeling cash straps or they feel that they have a lot of debt, what they do is they don't go and spend their money. What they do is that they save it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is not. It means that the stimulus is not working in the way those who designed it intended it to.
If you're trying to get money flowing in the economy and then people don't spend it, it's not working.
So we saw this with President Obama with the grants to the states. And the states had actually faced dramatic decrease in their revenue base because of the recession. And they had big budget gaps, which they can't have. And a lot of the money that they got from the federal government, they used to patch their budget deficits. They didn't actually spend it to go and hire workers and to basically they didn't spend it. So that's one of the things we saw with the Obama stimulus. The other thing that we know as a general rule with stimulus is by the time the government gets around to handing out the money and to give it to the states or the different actors, usually the economy itself has started to recover. That's one problem. So it's kind of like arguably, not as effective. The other thing is, like, it's often very poorly targeted. So when you have a recession, a true recession, the best way to spend your money, right, is to actually change the incentives, but also go and hire people in the unemployment lines. That's the way you get people back to work. And unfortunately, one of the things that we saw with the Obama stimulus is actually that it ended up being used for pay raises or for displacing workers who already had jobs to go do other jobs that this time around was supported by government money. And that just doesn't really help address the economic situation.
So if I'm hearing you right, tax cuts don't really work. Giving people money doesn't really work. Bailouts don't really work. What does? What should we do?
Well, so tax cut, depending on how they're designed, could work sometimes. But in a situation like the coronavirus, it's hard to see how it's going to work because it's a public health issue. But
it's also an economic issue.
It's an economic issue.
The public health issue has an effect on the economy.
I agree, but because it's a public health issue, you're going to have a very hard time telling people who are staying home and not spending money to actually go and spend money, even if you throw more cash at them.
So it's not about injecting money into the economy. What should we do then? What can policymakers do to combat what looks like the start of a recession?
It's hard to tell in this case, but one thing that if you wanted to give, and President Trump loves giving a positive jolt to the stock market. He seems to be just very in tune with what the stock market is doing. And one way to get the stock market going, at least for a little while, would be for him to announce that he's going to unilaterally get rid of all his tariffs. That would have a positive effect on the stock market for sure. And I assume that it would actually get China to get rid of its tariff, and then the Europeans and pretty much every country around the globe. Now, this is not the ultimate solution to every economic problems that we have because of this public health crisis, but certainly it would give a jolt to the stock market.
One other idea that people have talked about is paid leave. People have said that if we had a paid leave program in place, that would help people have money while they stayed home from work, which is what they need to do when there's a pandemic. Is that a good idea?
Well, there's always a problem with pushing a permanent solution for a temporary problem. So in this case, I would say, no, it's not a good idea. And the other problem is pushing a universal paid leave policy at the federal level for this particular crisis would be problematic. I mean, 75% of all workers in America have paid sick leave already, and 40% of part-time workers also have paid sick leave. So in order for paid sick leave policy put in place as an emergency and in a temporary basis, you would have to really actually target it to these workers in particular. If that is the case, if you can actually contain it to those workers who don't have it, there's a value to it. And I'm not opposed to the government in terms of extreme emergency doing things like this, as long as it's clear it's temporary. If really what you want to stop the spread of the virus is to keep sick people home, that could, help a little bit. That said, it may not help as much as we hope for in absence of widely available tests for the virus. And because what happens is like the symptoms don't appear between 2 and 14 days. So you have this, almost 2 weeks to spread the virus around. After that, yeah, sure, it'd be useful. But again, there's a big difference between trying to push a system, a permanent policy for this temporary crisis or putting in place a temporary measure. And the other problem with this, by the way, is if you don't target it to those who do not have paid leave, what you're going to end up having is a system where effectively you're shifting the responsibility of those companies who were providing paid leave privately to the taxpayers, because as we've seen in states that have adopted paid leave policy, those companies usually start telling their employees to first use the state-based policy, and then they'll fill the gap with theirs.
Yeah, this just seems like an example of what you were talking about before, which is that people are using this as an opportunity to push policies that they already believed in. In some cases, that might make sense in terms of trade and that being a temporary jolt to eliminate tariffs. But it seems like what we really need to do is solve the public health problem and treat this as a public health problem first.
And to that extent, a temporary emergency provision of sick leave to those who don't already have it could help to some extent.
Veronique, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.